The sky was burning. Smoke rolled across the river as shattered metal twisted and screamed. Under relentless artillery fire, the last bridge had fallen, and with it, the only hope of survival for hundreds of American soldiers. German troops watched from the opposite bank, certain the battle was over. No army, they thought, could rebuild under such fire. But then, figures emerged through the haze, engineers, not infantry. With trembling hands and burning lungs, they crawled onto the ruins, dragging steel beams and wooden planks through a storm of bullets. Every explosion shook the ground, yet they refused to stop. Blood mixed with river water. Tools fell, were picked up again. They weren't fighting to destroy, they were fighting to build. And that was the moment even the German soldiers lowered their rifles, because they couldn't believe what they were witnessing. It was the spring of 1945, the final, brutal months of World War II. Germany was collapsing, but its army was far from defeated. Rivers became fortresses, bridges became battlefields, and every crossing meant the difference between life and death. For the advancing American forces, time was everything. Tanks and supply convoys couldn't move without bridges, and the Germans knew it. They bombed and destroyed every structure they could, leaving behind shattered spans of steel and burning debris. But the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers carried something stronger than weapons: resolve. These were men trained not to take life, but to preserve it through courage and construction. Under fire, they worked with machine-like precision, turning chaos into order. Each bolt tightened, each plank laid, was an act of defiance against fear itself. Their mission wasn't just about repairing bridges, it was about rebuilding hope in a world torn apart by war. The mission was supposed to be simple: secure the crossing, rebuild the bridge, and advance the armored column. But nothing in war stays simple for long. When the engineers arrived at the riverbank, the air was already thick with smoke and dust. The remains of the old bridge jutted from the water like broken ribs, half swallowed by the current. Artillery shells thundered in the distance, each explosion echoing like a heartbeat of destruction. The enemy was watching. German observers hidden in the tree line relayed coordinates to their gunners. Within minutes, mortar rounds began to rain down. The engineers hit the dirt, clutching their helmets as the ground erupted around them. Some shouted prayers, others curses. They weren't soldiers in the usual sense. They carried tools, not rifles. Yet here they were, standing at the edge of hell, trying to rebuild a lifeline while death screamed from the sky. Orders crackled over the radio. Get that bridge up, no matter what it takes. The commander's voice was steady, but behind it was urgency. Every second lost meant hundreds of troops stranded on the wrong side of the river, vulnerable to counterattack. The engineers moved fast, dragging pontoon sections into place, securing cables, hammering, and welding with trembling hands. The river hissed and boiled with incoming shells. Private Thompson, a young engineer barely 21, kept his head down as he worked. The sweat on his face mixed with mud and fear. "They'll cut us to pieces," he muttered, but his sergeant snapped back, "Then we build faster." There was no time for fear, no room for hesitation. Across the river, the Germans watched in disbelief. Through binoculars, one officer barked, "They're rebuilding?" Under fire? Another replied coldly, "Impossible." But as the minutes turned to hours, it became clear, the Americans weren't retreating. They were constructing the impossible. Machine guns rattled from the ridge, cutting through the smoke. A truck carrying supplies exploded, throwing debris into the air. Still, the engineers pushed forward. They crawled through craters, waded into freezing water, and used their own bodies as shields to protect equipment. One man, hit in the leg, refused evacuation. "I can still use my hands," he said, continuing to hammer nails with blood dripping from his fingers. By nightfall, the riverbank looked like a graveyard of machinery, twisted metal, shattered helmets, scattered tools. Yet amid the wreckage, the bridge was beginning to take shape. It was fragile, uneven, but alive, a skeleton of hope rising from chaos. Every sound became a threat, every splash, every gust of wind could mean incoming fire. And yet, something unspoken began to spread among the men, a quiet defiance. They no longer looked at the explosions as enemies, but as reminders of what they had to overcome. When the German artillery paused for a brief moment, the engineers seized it. They worked without words, moving in rhythm like one organism, bound by courage. The bridge was no longer a structure, it was a statement, that even in the darkest hour of war, humanity could still build, still create, still stand unbroken. By dawn, the first outlines of the repaired span glimmered against the smoke-stained sky. The men stood silently for a moment, covered in dirt and sweat, knowing they had achieved what most thought was impossible. But deep down, they also knew, the real storm had yet to begin. When the first light of morning pierced through the smoke, the engineers were already at work, their silhouettes outlined against the dull glow of fire and fog. The bridge was half-finished, fragile, and exposed. Every plank nailed was an open challenge to the German guns watching from across the river. A low whistle echoed. The men froze. Then came the thunder, shells crashing into the far bank, spraying water and mud into the air. The river erupted like boiling oil. "Keep working," the lieutenant shouted, his voice hoarse from hours of yelling. The men obeyed, hands shaking as they drove spikes into the wooden beams. It wasn't just courage that kept them moving, it was duty, pride, and something more, a stubborn refusal to surrender to chaos. Nearby, Sergeant Wilkins coordinated the welding crew. His uniform was torn, his face blackened with soot. "We need the crossbeam secured," he barked. Two men dragged the steel bar into position, struggling as bullets snapped above their heads. Sparks flew from the welder's torch, lighting their faces like ghostly flames. Every moment alive felt borrowed, every breath a gamble. The Germans intensified their barrage. Mortars howled overhead, machine guns tore through the mist. One explosion ripped open a section of the bridge, flinging a man into the river below. Without hesitation, another engineer dove after him, disappearing beneath the churning current. Seconds later, both surfaced, gasping, and pulled themselves back onto the wreckage. There was no time to mourn, no time to rest, the structure had to stand. From the opposite bank, a German officer raised his binoculars again. "They're mad," he muttered. "They're building in the middle of our fire." A nearby soldier shook his head. "No, sir, they're winning." Despite the chaos, the Americans worked with precision. They communicated through hand signals, glances, and instinct. The clang of hammers replaced the sound of fear. The bridge grew, inch by inch, beam by beam. Engineers used whatever they could find, twisted rebar, burned timbers, even enemy debris, turning destruction into construction. Private Reynolds, his arm bandaged and slick with blood, leaned over a beam, tightening a bolt with one hand. His sergeant yelled, "You're hit, get to the medic." Reynolds shook his head. "The bridge comes first." That defiance echoed through the ranks. They weren't just following orders, they were protecting the soldiers who would soon cross that span, friends, brothers, and comrades whose lives depended on their success. Hours passed like minutes. The air stank of fuel, mud, and cordite. The river kept rising from rain upstream, threatening to undo everything. "We're losing time," the lieutenant shouted. "Get the pontoons ready." Crews raced to adjust the floating supports, hammering them into place as waves slapped against their legs. Another explosion sent a fireball into the air, knocking several men to the ground. Shrapnel ripped through the supply truck, scattering tools and lumber. Still, the work didn't stop. Every man had seen death too many times to fear it now. By afternoon, the bridge was almost complete. What had started as rubble now stretched halfway across the river, a skeletal pathway shimmering through the smoke. Tanks waited impatiently on the far bank, engines rumbling, ready to surge forward once the signal was given. But the Germans weren't finished. A barrage of heavy shells rained down, tearing through the sky. One direct hit shattered a section of the bridge, collapsing part of the framework. The engineers stared in silence for a heartbeat, then got back to work. There was no shouting, no hesitation, just grim determination. They rebuilt the destroyed section faster than anyone thought possible. By sunset, the impossible had become real. The bridge, battered, smoking, and scarred, stood strong enough for the first convoy to cross. The soldiers who had doubted it now watched in awe. Trucks rumbled forward, followed by tanks and artillery, each one rolling over the very structure built by bare hands under fire. The engineers stepped back, exhausted, covered in grime. Their faces reflected the glow of burning fields and the quiet satisfaction of victory earned not through destruction, but creation. For a brief moment, even the German guns fell silent. Across the river, enemy soldiers stared, not with hatred, but with disbelief. They had witnessed something few would ever forget, men who refused to yield, who rebuilt the world even as it fell apart around them. Across the river, silence began to spread like a shadow. The German forward units, who had been hammering the Americans since dawn, suddenly found themselves watching something unreal. Through the smoke and the thunder of their own guns, the bridge had come back to life. A young German corporal, his hands still gripping the trigger of his MG-42, blinked in disbelief. "It's standing again, they rebuilt it," he muttered. His officer, Captain Weiss, raised his binoculars, adjusting them with trembling fingers. "Keep firing," he ordered sharply, but there was doubt in his voice. He could see them clearly now, men in muddy uniforms, helmets glinting, working as if they were blind to death itself. Another soldier whispered, "Sir, they're not running, they're building." The captain lowered his binoculars slowly. "I've never seen anything like it." For hours, the Germans had believed they were crushing the American advance. They had destroyed every bridge across that river, turning it into a natural fortress. And yet, these engineers, men without rifles, men trained to create, not kill, were defying the very logic of war. Weiss hesitated. He could order more fire, but what was the point? The artillery crews were exhausted, and ammunition was running low. Each shell fired now felt wasted, as if the bridge itself refused to die. "They should have broken long ago," he murmured. "They're supposed to retreat, not rebuild." Somewhere down the line, a German radio operator spoke into his handset, voice heavy with disbelief. "Command, this is Delta Battery. The Americans, they're reconstructing under full fire. Repeat, they're rebuilding the bridge." Static filled the air, followed by silence. Even high command didn't seem to have an answer. Among the German infantrymen, emotions were mixed, frustration, respect, even awe. These weren't enemies anymore, they were forces of nature. One soldier turned to another and said quietly, "If they can build through this, then maybe we've already lost." The words hung in the smoke, heavier than the sound of artillery. As twilight fell, the American flag became visible through the haze, fluttering above the half-finished span. For the Germans, it wasn't just a sign of progress, it was defiance carved in steel and sweat. Weiss lowered his binoculars one final time. "They've earned that bridge," he said softly. "No amount of fire will take it from them now." The shelling slowed, then stopped. The battlefield grew eerily quiet. On both sides of the river, soldiers stared at the same thing, a fragile bridge holding firm against the weight of war. And in that stillness, amid the smoke and the broken earth, even the enemy understood, some victories are not written in destruction, but in the courage to build when all seems lost. As darkness fell across the battlefield, the bridge shimmered like a ghost over the river, half smoke, half steel, yet unbroken. The American engineers had done it. Against all odds, they had carved a path through destruction itself. But the story didn't end there. The real miracle came when the engines began to roar. On the far bank, columns of tanks and armored vehicles lined up, waiting for the signal to cross. Radio chatter crackled with disbelief. "Bridge is holding, repeat, bridge is holding." Commanders gave cautious orders, not trusting what their eyes were seeing. The first tank, a Sherman, rolled forward, its treads grinding against the wooden planks that hours earlier hadn't even existed. The engineers stood aside, waving it through like guardians of a miracle. Each rumble of metal over the river sent vibrations through the entire structure, but it held firm. Behind the tanks came supply trucks, medics, and infantry, all crossing into enemy territory under the protective veil of night. The bridge, born in chaos, was now the artery of victory. Across the river, the Germans could only watch. Their artillery positions were compromised, their flank exposed. What had been a defensive advantage just hours before had turned into a deadly trap. American forces were advancing faster than anyone anticipated. Panic began to spread among the German lines. "They're crossing. The bridge is intact," shouted a radio operator. But there was no plan left to stop them. By dawn, the sound of battle shifted. Instead of the thunder of explosions, there was the steady, rhythmic growl of engines rolling eastward. The river, once a line of separation, had become a symbol of American determination. The engineers, exhausted and battered, leaned against the railings, watching their brothers in arms storm forward. Some smiled faintly, others simply stared, too drained to feel anything but relief. Lieutenant Harris, the man who had refused to retreat, stood in silence. "We built it," he whispered. His voice cracked, but his eyes were steady. "They said it couldn't be done." Beside him, Sergeant Wilkins replied quietly, "They said a lot of things." News of the bridge spread rapidly through the ranks. Soldiers spoke of it as a miracle, a feat of bravery that turned defeat into momentum. Within days, the repaired crossing became the lifeline for reinforcements, supplies, and medics. What began as a desperate act of survival became the turning point of the entire campaign. For the Germans, it was more than a tactical loss, it was psychological. They had thrown everything they had, artillery, airstrikes, machine gun fire, yet the Americans refused to break. The bridge became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that courage could be stronger than firepower. As the sun rose and the river glimmered red with reflection, one thing became clear: the war was far from over, but its balance had shifted. That bridge, built under fire, repaired with blood and will, had changed everything. When the thunder of engines faded and the smell of smoke began to drift away, the battlefield fell into a haunting silence. The bridge still stood, scarred, splintered, and blackened by fire, yet alive. The engineers who had built it sat on the muddy ground, helmets off, hands trembling from exhaustion. Some smiled faintly. Others stared blankly across the river, as if still waiting for another shell to fall. In the hours that followed, medics moved quietly among the men, tending to wounds that no one had time to notice during the chaos. Several engineers were missing. A few lay still near the riverbank, their tools beside them, hammers, wrenches, and spools of wire, the instruments of their battle. For them, the bridge was both victory and grave. Word of their achievement spread like wildfire through Allied lines. Officers spoke their names with pride, and even the battle-hardened infantry paused to honor them. The story of the bridge under fire became legend overnight. Newspapers would later describe it as an act of mechanical genius and fearless devotion, but those who were there knew it was something simpler, something deeper. It was humanity refusing to collapse under the weight of war. When General Patton heard of the engineers' success, he reportedly said, "That bridge didn't just carry tanks, it carried the spirit of this army." The Corps of Engineers received commendations, though many of the heroes would never live to see them. Their courage wasn't captured in medals or parades, it was written in the timbers and bolts that still held firm long after the smoke had cleared. Across the river, German prisoners were marched past the reconstructed span. Many stopped to look, some in silence, some shaking their heads in disbelief. One officer muttered softly, "They built faster than we could destroy." Another replied, "Then we never had a chance." The bridge remained in service for months after the battle, carrying thousands of troops and tons of supplies toward final victory. It stood through storms, air raids, and retreating chaos until the day the war finally ended. And when peace came, the army dismantled it piece by piece, not out of defeat, but because it had served its purpose. Yet its memory never faded. Veterans who crossed it would later tell their children, that bridge was built by heroes. For the men who constructed it under fire, it was never about glory. It was about survival, brotherhood, and the unbreakable belief that even in the darkest hours, courage can build where destruction reigns. That bridge became more than steel and wood, it became a monument to the human spirit itself. War often remembers the ones who destroy, the generals, the bombers, the conquerors. But history rarely speaks of those who built. The American engineers who repaired that bridge under fire were not men seeking glory, they were men who believed that life, no matter how fragile, was worth preserving even amid death. They stood in the open, unarmed except for their courage, defying the laws of war itself. Every hammer strike, every bolt fastened, was a declaration that humanity still existed, that in a world consumed by hate, there were still hands that built rather than broke. Their bridge was more than wood and iron, it was a heartbeat, a pulse of defiance echoing through the chaos. Even the Germans who watched could not deny what they saw. They had witnessed bravery in many forms, but never like this, men who fought without fighting, who conquered through creation. In the ashes of war, that bridge became a symbol that no bomb, no bullet, no hatred could erase. And so, long after the rivers ran quiet and the guns went silent, their story remained, whispered through generations of soldiers, engineers, and dreamers. Because courage is not only found in those who charge forward, but also in those who stand still, and build the impossible. Their legacy was not destruction, it was hope rebuilt under fire.